It's been 1 year since President Barack Obama gave his speech in Cairo, where he laid out his plan for U.S. engagement with the Muslim world. We spoke with Professor Reza Aslan to talk to him about the speech, what was significant, where Obama has had his wins, and where he's come up short.
He has done absolutely nothing to change the policy, whether it's regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or in Iraq, or in Afghanistan, or frankly in the larger war on terror.
Reza Aslan, his thoughts and opinions on Obama, the Cairo speech, and the Muslim world 1 year later, in his own words.
Mr. Aslan, I want to thank you for taking some time out
My pleasure.
to meet with us. But what I wanted to ask was, last year in Cairo, President Obama gave his big speech to the Muslim world.
The relationship between Islam and the West includes centuries of coexistence and cooperation, but also conflict and religious wars.
It's been a year later. Take us back a year. What was the speech about and what was significant? Why did he reach out to the quote-unquote the Muslim world?
I think there were two important factors to that speech. The first one you got right off the bat in the way that he presented his own story, growing up in a Muslim majority country, having members of his family who were Muslim. Part of the process of that was to change the narrative of relations between the United States and Muslim majority countries around the world. The biggest sort of victory that Obama had in that speech is that he began the process of reframing that relationship, talking to Muslims from a place of respect, talking to them with knowledge about the history and culture of Islam. He stepped away from the kind of religiously polarizing clash of civilizations rhetoric of the previous administration, of a President Bush who would say, well, of course Muslims are our friends, but then would begin talking in these polarizing terms that made it very clear. Exactly, you're with us or against us, a crusade, axis of evil, all these things, exactly. And now, it may seem like a small thing, but it's not a small thing. I mean, words actually do matter. President Obama was right about this. So I think that was his first thing. The second thing, of course, was to just sort of lay out the Obama initiative for the region. So the reason I'm focusing on these two things is because one of them he did very well, talking correctly, changing the rhetoric, changing the narrative. The other thing has been a complete and utter disaster, an absolute catastrophe, because he has done absolutely nothing to change the policy, whether it's regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or in Iraq, or in Afghanistan, or frankly in the larger war on terror. Unfortunately, he made a dramatic mistake in abandoning Bush's democracy promotion agenda, which haphazard and hypocritical as it was, when Muslims are asked in every single poll, what is your number one concern, what is your number one aspiration, they don't talk about Israel, they don't talk about Islamic law, they say democracy.
So then how does President Obama, well, first of all, is it fair to put it all on him? I mean, there are governments and people in the Muslim world who need to take on these issues. Can't put it all on President Obama, number one.
You're absolutely right. There are many factors involved in this, not least of which, of course, are these despotic regimes in the region who do not want any kind of democracy, except that we are still the richest, most powerful, most influential nation in the world. So when the President of the United States decides to address the Muslim world, and he does it from Egypt, the land of one of the absolute worst dictators in the entire Muslim world, an autocrat who's been in power for 30 years, who before the president arrived, just before he arrived, went on this tirade in which he arrested journalists, bloggers, in which he took democratically elected members of parliament and threw them into prison. When the President of the United States shows up and stands next to you and doesn't say anything about that, that is an explicit approval of your policies. To not even talk about democracy in general is, I think, appalling and a huge failure on his part. Is it a coincidence that our greatest allies in the Middle East are all dictatorships? Of course not. The dictatorships help American policy because we feel like it's much easier to control one person than it is to control an entire population. That has been the founding philosophy of how to deal with the Middle East from the United States for 5 decades. And it's been a total failure. We have achieved neither stability nor security.
Let me ask you this question. Muslims in other parts of the world don't hate Americans, but they hate, for example, U.S. foreign policy. But if you're suggesting that Obama is sort of toting the line and doing exactly what we've done in the past, then how will there be this sort of coming of the two worlds?
You're absolutely right. Look, the American image, the American ideal, what this country stands for in political participation, human rights, separation of powers, the rule of law. This is something that I think people all over the world, not just Muslims, but people all over the world know and recognize, and they appreciate. But when we violate those principles and those ideals, when we say political participation is okay as long as you're on our side, if you're the Muslim Brotherhood, no, not for you. That kind of message just simply is no longer sustainable. I'm saying that it's part of our national security in the United States. How we stay safe in this country is by promoting political development and political participation, even by groups that we don't like, because that is the only road to true stability.
Okay, one final question. President Obama has made an attempt at least to address the Muslim world. Do you think he's done enough to address mainstream Americans about the Muslims that are already here?
You know, it's funny because he did it first. It's something that he himself has taken on, on his own. In a way, he sort of set himself up as this bridge between the two. And I think it's worked. I mean, I really do think that the sort of foundational view of Americans about Muslims has changed a lot, obviously, since September 11th. But we've got a long way to go. There's still a lot of mistrust, a lot of misconceptions about Islam and about Muslims. The one thing that we have going for us here as American Muslims is that as an immigrant community, we have the absolute highest levels of education and literacy. As an economic community, we're one of the wealthiest communities in the United States. I think it's going to take maybe a generation to kind of recognize that Muslims are as much a part of the religious fabric of this country as anyone else. And by the way, we're not the first people to go through this. I mean, in the 20th century, the Jews had to go through this exact same process. They were a fifth column. They didn't really belong here. They weren't really Americans. They look different. They pray differently. They act differently. They dress differently. They're not like us. Nobody says that now. And the same happened to Catholics in the 19th century. Catholics who were actually stripped of their human rights by federal laws because we were told their allegiance is to Rome, not to the United States. Nobody thinks that anymore.
Right.
Give it one generation, no one will think this of Muslims.
Well, we'll see.
Inshallah.
Reza, Aslan, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.